Good evening, everyone. I'm Ryan Smart, and I'm here with Chloe Doherty, the Florida Springs Council Communications Director. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for a live discussion with Christopher Meindl, the author of a wonderful new book on Florida's springs. We're going to get to a Q&A between me and Professor Meindl in a moment, and I'd like to invite everyone and encourage you to order his new book. You can order it at the web address that you see there. University Press has given Florida Springs Council members and really anybody watching this webinar a code to get a significant discount off the book. So you can use code FSC24 when you check out to get that discount. I think after you hear our discussion tonight, you'll definitely want to purchase the book. We're just going to be talking about a small portion of the book. It is a really excellent primer on springs, both the science, the geography, the politics, and the restoration aspects. I found it to be a really enjoyable read, and I learned a lot. But it's very accessible. You could spend your life working on springs like I do, or know almost nothing, and I think you'd get a lot out of the book either way. So please check that out and buy yourself a copy. Chloe, why don't you tell us about the summit and what's been going on in the springs world over the last few months?
Yes, of course. So before we get into the live discussion, which I know everyone is anticipating and waiting for, just some Springs news updates. We did reschedule our Spring Summit. It is now happening in 2025. And look forward to gathering with everyone at Stetson Law School in Gulfport, Florida on February 8th. And you can register for the Spring Summit at floridaspringscouncil.org/summit or scan the QR code there on the left. It is open to any Springs advocates or experts. If you hear this discussion and you want to figure out how you can get more involved in Springs protection and advocacy, definitely suggest coming to the event. It'll be a great opportunity to learn and network with other Springs advocates and experts like Ryan and Chris. And some other Springs news updates. We have been engaged in the Springs BMAPS issue for quite some time now. That is the Springs Basin Management Action Plans, which are essentially the state's plans to clean up and restore outstanding Florida springs. DEP has been hosting public meetings throughout the year on the Springs BMAP updates, which DEP has to update the Springs BMAPs by July 1st, 2025. So we encourage all Springs advocates to get engaged in that process to learn more about the Springs BMAP in your local area, which you can learn more about your local Springs BMAP, including Springs by Spring updates and information, diving deep into the data at floridaspringscouncil.org/Springs BMAPs, and that QR code on the right will take you to that website to get engaged and learn more. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Chloe. All right, and now it's my pleasure to bring on Dr. Christopher Meindl. And as we get going, of course, these recordings, like all the FSC webinars, are available on Facebook and YouTube. You can type your questions directly into the comment box on Facebook or YouTube, and we will get them here on the webinar. We're going to hold those questions and answer them with Chris at the end. If you really enjoy this, you want to share it with your friends, there will be recordings available on Facebook and YouTube pretty much right after we wrap up. All right, well, welcome, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
Awesome. So let's start out. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And, out of all of the things that a Florida studies professor could write about, why you chose to write about a book on Florida springs?
As a geographer, very interested in places generally, both how they might be similar and how they might be different. And of course, springs provide a wonderful opportunity to examine similarities and differences among these special places. And of course, some of this can go back maybe as far as childhood with going with my father and brother. We were both, my brother and I, very young, 10 years old or something like that, to Ocala National Forest's Juniper Springs. And what a beautiful and magical place, even now, but certainly it was that way to me 50 years ago. And taking the Juniper Springs run and always thinking about, where does all this water come from? Well, now as a geography professor studying things like water resources, and springs are certainly a part of that, provided a wonderful opportunity to investigate them a little bit further and learn more about them.
Yeah, well, I think not only learn more about them, but teach all of us more about them too. So you start off your book by stating there's an ongoing struggle for truth about Florida Springs, and then you specifically mention struggles in both science and politics. And I agree with you that there are struggles for the truth in the science and especially in the politics. So in the limited time we have here today, I think I really want to dive into those uncertainties a little bit. So let's start with the science side of it. So you talk about threats to spring flow. And I think a lot of people in the environmental community really focus on the impact of groundwater pumping. But you spend a good deal of time talking about some of the alternative influences on spring flow, many of which are championed by our water management districts and make their way in to the models that impact minimum flows and consumptive use permitting. So can you talk a little bit about some of the other things that impact springs flow and, maybe how those affect water management district decisions?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I think most folks with water management districts would say that spring flow is perhaps most heavily impacted by changes in rainfall. And rainfall, of course, is never the same from one year to the next. And it can be different from one decade to the next and over multiple decades. And, we can quibble about why that's so, but I think the data reflects that there are at least somewhat modest changes in rainfall over time. How much should those impact spring flow is still, I think, a subject of debate or uncertainty. But so is what happens to that rainfall as it makes its way into the ground. Because as you know, the Floridian aquifer, we use that one phrase to describe a pretty complicated situation underneath us. For one thing, the Floridian aquifer is broken up into both upper and lower Floridian aquifers and divided by a relatively impermeable or less permeable barrier. But as it happens, there is some movement, I think, through that barrier. And so there's some very recent work that suggests, well, rainfall may ultimately spend some time making its way into the lower Floridian aquifer before we finally see a significant signal at the surface. So anyhow, we have differences in rainfall, but then water weighs a lot, right? As anybody who's ever carried just a gallon of water up a flight of stairs would tell you. And so if for whatever reason the level of water above a spring increases even a little bit, and it doesn't take much, just an inch or so adds a significant amount of weight on top of the spring itself. Essentially, if you could imagine putting something heavy on a pot that's on the stove, it'll keep that material inside. So what might cause the level of the water in a spring to be elevated? Well, maybe there could be vegetation that grows in profusion, perhaps hydrilla or some other species. And we've all had occasion to maybe get stuck in some hydrilla or maybe even some algae infested waters. And that might slow the water down so that it allows water to back up on top of the spring and then ultimately press down on top of the spring, reducing spring flow. But for maybe Springs Coast springs or those near other places that might flood, for example, sea level rise can cause the flow of water away from a spring to slow down and possibly back up near where the spring water comes out of the ground. So there's a handful of of reasons for why spring flow might change over time.
Right, and sticking with the rainfall, which I think the districts would argue is probably the major driver. One thing that seemed to be kind of a paradox is that when we're dealing with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, where there has been reduced rainfall, that is responsible for reduced spring flow. They would say that the majority of the reason the springs there have reduced flow is not due to the pumping, but due to the reduced rainfall. When we get up into the north of Gainesville and the Santa Fe and Sewanee during the same period, we've actually seen increases in rainfall that have not been associated with increased spring flow. So it seems that with the idea of some of that water going down and mixing with the lower aquifer, it seems like a paradox as to why that would only show, decreased rainfall would be showing up immediately at the spring vent, while increased rainfall would be showing up potentially decades later. Is there any good reason why those two the system would function differently in that way?
I think this is part of what scientific community is still trying to wrestle with. We think of that dividing line between the upper and lower Floridian aquifer as relatively impermeable, as if it's a perfectly even seal up and down the state. My suspicion is that it's a little more leaky in some places than in others, but you can't see it, and it takes an enormous amount of effort to try and figure out where it might be a little more leaky, where there might be some more exchange between upper and lower Floridian aquifer systems.
So it could be regional geology, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the aquifer itself is, or the upper Floridian aquifer itself, may be a bit more permeable in some places than in others. And part of those differences may help explain spring flow in different places. And that's what's interesting about geography generally, is the fact that sometimes generalizations that we come up with that maybe appear to explain what's going on, whether it's changes in rainfall leading to changes in spring flow, they may work in some places, but they're inadequate in others. And so we need a lot more explanation of particular places and what's going on in particular places or particular spring sheds to be able to determine with a little bit more certainty what's really happening there.
Right. And I think one of the frustrations for springs advocates is it seems that those assumptions are almost always going in one direction from the districts that it's not pumping. I remember up at Wakulla Springs near Tallahassee, they had the wastewater treatment plant and they had to achieve water quality goals. And the districts and DEP swore that it took nearly a century for the water from that wastewater treatment plant to reach Wakulla Springs. And some environmental groups said, well, hey, let's do a dye test, right? And we saw that dye in a couple of weeks. And it's like, well, can you really be off by 100 years on your assumptions? And I know, like, when we challenged, water quality, we challenged the basic management action plans, we saw that, it's all assumptions, but every assumption was kind of leaning in one direction. None of the assumptions were towards the environmental protection. They were all kind of done to minimize the impact and minimize, restoration. I don't think there's much we can do to control rainfall in Florida.
Right.
And I haven't heard people advocating for taking all the plants. We'd love to see algae reduced, but we're not going to go take the plants out of the springs. Right. So, it seems to me that in these regulatory programs, there's really only one thing we can control from a regulatory system, and that is pumping. So when you look at a regime like the minimum flows and levels, which is specifically designed to prevent significant harm from springs, so they put all these other factors into the minimum flows and levels, but at the end of the day, Mother Nature doesn't really care, right? If the spring flow drops below a certain amount, it still reduces passage or whatever the impacts would be. So would you agree that when it comes to the regulatory programs, we need to kind of focus on what we can control?
Sure. I don't think there's much question about that. And I think it's also unfortunate that it seems to me from statements from lots of leading public figures that constant growth and the faster we can make the growth machine move seems to be the priority. And well, we'll figure out stuff as we go if there are problems. Well, I don't know. I think that particular assumption probably ought to be challenged, that maybe fanning the flames of growth as fast as we can, maybe we ought to challenge that assumption.
And that's really one of the big disconnects. It seems like, when you go up to Tallahassee or you're in local governments, that does seem to be the mantra, kind of growth at any cost. And, it's not about preservation, it's about mitigation. And I would argue that mitigation, you never really replace the thing that you lost. I mean, I think that's what we've seen with wetlands permitting, water use,
Sure.
Whatever these things are. But when I talk to people around the state, I think people are fed up with the growth, especially the irresponsible, old school growth. I mean, you have any thoughts on that?
No, you're absolutely right about that. And here's the thing: the whole growth thing benefits some people way more than others. It benefits, and I don't want to pick on the business community generally because it's not necessarily their fault to think about it in these terms, but growth definitely benefits that segment of the population much more so than everybody else. And so there's a significant impetus to keep that going, both at the local level as well as at the state and federal levels. That community and some members in that community, and I suppose that's what I should clarify, some members of business community push very hard to make sure that growth continues apace. Meanwhile, the rest of us are left to deal with the problems growth causes.
Right. That's, political science. We talk a lot about concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, and, how those, that just reality can lead to negative outcomes. It does seem that in the election that we just had, while on one hand, conservative candidates and policies did well, so did conservation and anti-growth. In the very same election, we saw Seminole County pass several charter initiatives that protect their rural boundaries and limit development. We saw pro smart growth candidates win in Orange County. And recently we saw the city of Orlando reject the massive annexation of the Deseret development, which certainly would have added massively to their tax base. I mean, if you want to grow, doubling the size of your city is a heck of a way to do it. But that got rejected, which I was hoping for, but much more swiftly and decisively than I thought possible. So you really see that conflict, and hopefully we're beginning to get some pushback, towards we're not going to stop growth, but I think we can grow a lot more responsibly.
And yes, manage it a fair bit better and deal with its consequences. I don't think. Well, there might be some voices who say stop growth, period. But I think most thinking people are prepared to accept some growth as long as it is managed properly. And if it's corralled, if it's turned into something that provides positives for everybody or almost everybody instead of just a select few, while everybody else has to deal with the problems it causes.
Back to minimum flows and levels. One of the things that I really learned in discussion that I enjoyed from your book was how the 15% habitat loss standard came to be. So, when the water management districts are setting minimum flows and levels, it's basically assumed around the state that 15% habitat loss is quote unquote significant harm, as if that is a hard and fast rule brought down to us, on a tablet 2,000 years ago. But you actually worked with the professor that came up with that standard. Would you tell that story?
Yes. Dr. Jim Gore and I were sitting around the break room one time, and he was he was telling me about this work he had been doing in the Peace River, and I think he was actually reviewing minimum flow and level study. And in those days, what was significant harm? The legislature couldn't or didn't define it. And so it was up to the scientific community to kind of try to define it, but there was no easy definition. So he and his colleagues reviewed the literature, and they couldn't find much of anything that would help describe what would be significant harm. So I don't think they pulled this number out of a hat. I think they've got more to it than this, but they came up with a number of 15% reduction of habitat loss. And he says everybody was ticked off with them. The environmentalists thought, no, that's way too much. That number should be much lower. Significant harm should be something like the single digits of habitat loss. And the development community was equally irritated with them because they argued that, oh, come on, 15% is nothing. It should be up there around 25 or 30%. And in fact, in some jurisdictions outside of Florida, it is relatively high, upwards of 25% or so. So he and his colleagues, I think, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, if we've irritated everybody, we're probably close to something like truth. But even then, at the end of the day, I don't think there's been a significant effort to modify that number because, as you're probably aware, in many other studies, they all go back to Jim Gore and his colleagues who came up with this 15% number. Everybody cites that as if it belongs in the gospel, in the Bible. And it's taken almost as a matter of course that, this is the number. This is what we should all be working with. And I think he would get if he's listening, he'd probably be chuckling about the development of that number and the attention it gets now and the maybe over-reliance on that number rather than maybe continued investigation into what really constitutes significant harm.
One of the things that really stood out to me was, he developed that standard, I think, believing it would just be for the Peace River.
Yes.
Is that true? Right?
Yes.
He wasn't tasked with coming up with a standard for all Florida rivers or all Florida springs. He was looking at one particular water body. And the idea that one standard can be translated into, the Ichetucknee is so different than the Sewanee, which is so different than silver, which is so different than rock, right? And the fact that we come up with one number for one system, and then we say, hey, this is what it should be for everyone, for every water body. I think a lot of people don't know that that's where that standard comes from. And of course, that doesn't mean, as you point in the book, a 15% reduction in flow. Right. What leads to a 15% habitat loss could be very different for different, sure. In one system, it could be 7% reduction in flow could do it, while in another, it may be a much higher percent.
That's absolutely right.
Flow, right?
It's absolutely right. And I agree with that idea that the Peace River, talk about a different system, one that has sinkholes under its bed and so on and so forth. It's not exactly the same as most of these other systems that we've applied that logic to. And I think geographers everywhere would be maybe as annoyed as you are that we have taken the same number and basically used it universally.
Right. I mean, you have to have a number, I think,
Yeah.
One of the issues is that 15% tends to be translated directly to only pumping, so the impact from pumping. So even if you have the habitat loss, if you can't tie that loss, as we saw in our Rainbow River Challenge, directly to pumping, then they say, well, it's those other factors that you talked about earlier.
Right. You could have a string of dry years which causes terrible habitat loss, but then, maybe water managers say, well, we're not going to reduce pumping because the pumping isn't the problem, it's the rainfall. But habitat loss is habitat loss, isn't it?
That's what we saw in our Rainbow River MFL challenge was, everyone agreed that there wasn't enough water. The big disagreement was why. And, as we talked about earlier, even though the only control is the pumping, they said, no, you're fine because yes, you don't have the water, but it's all of these other, factors, not the pumping in the area. Although, while rainfall may have decreased, pumping has certainly increased. And I think it's one of the frustrations with some of these very opaque models, as opposed to something maybe Dr. Knight would argue for, a water balance budget. As you talk about, we get a fair amount of rain in Florida.
Right.
Most of it goes back up.
Sure.
Right. So
more than half of it going right back up into the air as evapotranspiration. And so when we don't get average rainfall, there's a lot less recharge to the groundwater system.
And what happens to pumping in those dry years?
Well, maybe water managers would say, well, if it gets really ugly, we'll call for voluntary restrictions that are not terribly well enforced. And by the way, with constant growth, what are we going to do? You can't have constant growth and then have a little bit less water and then expect there not to be a problem. The same thing's true in transportation systems. We build highways, which work fine until what? Until there's an accident. And then there's a gigantic mess because now we have way too many people backed up and so on and so forth. And the same kind of thing can happen to groundwater recharge and springs if we have even a modest reduction of rainfall under natural circumstances, which we know is going to happen, right? History suggests it's not maybe, it's when we will have drier years than average.
Right. I'm pretty sure you write in the book that in those, drought type years, pumping goes up because, agriculture needs more pumping to, deal with the crops. People use more water on their lawns, which is, one of my pet peeves, one of the big, domestic uses of water. So we kind of get a double whammy, right? When we have lots of rain, we get less pumping, but when we need the rain to stay in the aquifer, we need the increased flow. That tends to be when pumping increases, right?
That's exactly it. And the data are very clear on that when we experience drought, people turn on the sprinklers to save their lawns. And of course, it doesn't help that fully half, on average, half of our water use goes to watering grass and plants outside. That could be a heck of a lot less and probably should be if only we could accept something other than the nice green lawn that everybody thinks is so nice.
Well, it's definitely the low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at where you're going to cut back, of everything, I saw Charles Lee give a presentation more than a decade ago where he, said, was basically trying to give the statistic about why. He said, the number one thing we use water for is a crop that we, fertilize and we water and then we grow it and then we cut it and throw it away. And people looked at him like he was insane. He said, I don't know what it is. And, so they fill up a bag of grass. And, I think that's a great way to illustrate it that, we the same kind of attention that we give to our peppers and our cucumbers and our tomatoes, but then we eat them goes to a crop really that we just then bag and put out for the trash man. And generally pay someone else to cut, kind of a patient cycle. Yeah. So turning to water quality, DEP, FDACs, environmentalists, we all talk about nitrogen. The B maps are for nitrogen.
The bad boy of Florida Springs.
As you point out, it's not really nitrogen that we're concerned about. It's algae. Yes. Right? It's nitrogen. There's lots of things in the water that don't have negative influences, right? Don't have negative effects. We care about the nitrogen because the general belief is that that is feeding the algae, which then, of course, has all kinds of negative consequences of killing off our submerged aquatic vegetation and ruining recreational opportunities. Similar to the 15% standard, you write that basically there was a Florida Springs task force that said, nitrogen is the major cause of algae blooms. One of the things that I didn't even realize, despite having worked on the law for years, is a lot of the findings in Senate Bill 552, which we'll talk about later, passed in 2016, come word for word out of that Florida Springs task force report, which I didn't realize until I read your book. So, you kind of find one thing that people agree on, and then you run with it. But you talk to folks who have some alternative explanations for why we may be seeing increases in nitrogen in our springs. Talk about some of those.
Yes, and these are, I guess, maybe more working hypotheses than very clear explanations, but certainly some species of snails that are that munch on this algae, they play an important role in many springs. And if for whatever reason they go missing, just like if our lawnmower breaks down or runs out of gas, well, then guess what happens? Then the algae continue to proliferate, and there's nothing there to cut it down or to keep it in check. And listen, springs have always had some algae, and reasonable quantities of it, just not significant clumps that blanket the benthos generally, and certainly not significant clumps that are floating at the surface. So anyhow, there's the snails that might conceivably go missing, and we might say, well, then why do these snails go missing from time to time? Well, it might be that they encounter water that has temporarily low dissolved oxygen, and it doesn't take low dissolved oxygen for very long to be a very big problem. It would be kind of like, oh, okay, well, we can't temporarily do without oxygen except for maybe a handful of seconds, right? If it's a few days, then that's the end. So then what might be causing those bouts of low dissolved oxygen? Well, the conventional wisdom was that maybe it is a higher percentage of older groundwater that's been beneath the surface in the dark for a long period of time, and maybe it has been exposed to at least some bacteria that have gobbled up all of that dissolved oxygen, or much of the dissolved oxygen, so that if that water makes its way out a spring vent, then we have low DO water, and that's not good for snails. Except that in some places, like in Juniper Springs, which has a relatively high percentage of older water, it also has one of the highest rates of dissolved oxygen in it. So that has created a little bit of a conundrum. Is it really just older water that might cause low dissolved oxygen? Well, certainly not in all cases, and certainly not in Juniper Springs case. But, other possible explanations revolve around flow. If flow is reduced for whatever reason, whether it's lack of rainfall or excessive groundwater pumping or whatever, that slows down the flow of water from a spring vent and then down the spring run. And when flow returns, it can push away some of that algae, as long as it hasn't grown into such dense mats that even a slight increase in flow can't push it away. But if flow is maintained at a relatively high rate, it can serve as a scouring mechanism to get rid of excess quantities of algae. And so anything that reduces flow can allow algae to pile up. Let's see, I was trying to think, was there another one? There was the snails, there was the
brownouts.
Flow. Pardon?
Brownouts.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, for springs that are near river systems, when they flood, and flood they do under natural circumstances, there can be an invasion of dark water into a spring. I remember going to visit Gilchrist Blue Springs a couple of years ago with a class full of students, and they almost looked at me like, "Why are we even here? This is kind of gross, and you can't be serious. This doesn't really look like a spring," because you couldn't see a spring boil or anything. The Swanee River had basically invaded and turned out the lights on the plants below. So all of these things can combine to cause a series of problems, and cascading ones in springs, because if the vegetation goes missing, well, then so do all the critters that depend on the vegetation, whether it's for food or cover. And then so do the big critters that depend on the little critters, and so on and so forth.
And with snails and dissolved oxygen and brownouts, we don't really have a lot of data, do we? Going back 50, 60 years to even be able to establish that those things have changed.
Boy, that's another part of the problem. I mean, springs analysts aren't completely helpless. We've got some data, and in some cases, whether it's Silver Springs or otherwise, we've got a fair bit of data. But in most springs, we have little, or in many cases, no data with which to try and study the stuff. And even in some cases where we do, well, some of those readings, like from the very early 20th century, or even a small number of, for instance, spring discharge from the late 19th century, we might have one measurement, and then separated by 15 or 20 years from another single measurement. And we have no idea the circumstances under which that single measurement was taken. We don't know very much about the reliability of the instruments used to collect that data, and we may have caught that spring at a good time or at a bad time in terms of flow, because as consistent as springs appear, they're almost always changing throughout the course of the year, wet season, dry season, in terms of the amount of flow or discharge that they produce.
And we don't really have a good answer to how to bring the snails back, or increase dissolved oxygen, or stop the brownouts. I mean, if anything, the best guess is probably restoring flow on all of those, what we would think of as, potentially water quality issues.
Right.
But, in our state rules, do the water management districts look at water quality when they're handing out consumptive use permits that reduce the flow?
No, they're concerned with water quantity, and they leave to the state to wrestle with issues of water quality. But these things could be a heck of a lot more tightly woven together than is dealt with by the agencies themselves.
Well, we kind of know they are, right? Because water quality is measured as a concentration, right?
Right.
It's milligrams per liter.
Right.
So you've got two ways to improve water quality in the spring. You can reduce the amount of nitrogen going into the system, or you can increase the flow. You can, reduce the numerator, or you can increase the denominator.
Right.
And, when we look at our spring systems, looking at the latest basin management action plans that Chloe was talking about earlier, we need to reduce the concentration of nitrogen by 50, 60, 70, 80% in a lot of these spring systems. It seems to me that increasing flow is going to have to be part of the answer, because,
Right.
just like reducing your household budget, might be able to reduce it by 20%. You had to reduce it by 80%. We're all in a lot of trouble, right? So, at that point, you're looking, at increasing your income. If you're expensive, and I think it's the same thing here, where we're going to have to make significant improvements in flow if we have any chance of reaching those water quality measures.
Right. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, you're right. And what's amazing is that in many environmental systems, not just springs, but certainly it includes springs, if we can find ways to reduce the pressure on them. And in this case, we're talking about flow. Okay, reduce the pressure of low flows. In other words, increase flows, then they're capable of repairing themselves if we can reduce the pressure on some of these fundamental characteristics.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I love working on springs is, there is a real way to restore them back to where they were, at least when I was a little kid, where I think some of our other, significant ecological features have been so, remade by man that it's going to be hard to get them back to how they were. All right, let's get into the politics while we have time. As a political science junkie, one of my favorite parts of the book was your discussion of the rise of neoliberalism in the Florida legislature. Can you talk about what neoliberalism is and how it's impacted Springs and Florida's environment overall?
Yes, neoliberalism is and all of its derivatives. It's a very interesting phrase. It basically goes back to the ancient meaning of liberal, right? From Latin, meaning free or freedom. And so neoliberals are those who prefer significant increases in freedom, specifically freedom from government intervention, freedom from regulations, and allowing free markets and free enterprise to do its thing, respecting private property rights and the freedom to use property the way they want. And so that's essentially what neoliberals are all about. And there has been a hefty increase in neoliberal thinking over the past several decades and not just here in Florida, but I dare say nationally as well, but particularly here in Florida. And of course, that neoliberal impulse, the whole, hey, let's reduce government regulation, let's trust free enterprise and free markets more than we have in the past, and let's respect private property rights, all of which sound like good things, but they have consequences for environments like Springs. That kind of thinking is probably not such a bad idea in the early 20th century when there were relatively few people here in Florida. And so, sure, let people do whatever they want to do, and let's have government out of the way and all of that. The problem now is 22 or 23 million residents later, plus 140 million tourists every year. Neoliberal thinking can put enormous pressure on a range of environmental systems, Springs and otherwise.
One of the things that I'm fond of saying is that, despite that, I think we've actually still have some very good environmental laws in Florida. And you write specifically about the 2016 Senate Bill 552 that I worked on for several years to get it passed and continue to work on today to try to get it implemented. And that was obviously passed by conservative legislators and signed into law by Governor Scott, and at least endorsed by industry groups. And it was kind of a big sausage making process with some good and some bad. But then at the end of the day, we don't see those laws actually implemented, right? So it's kind of, it's not only on the legislature, but that neoliberalism seems to have really taken over our agencies as well. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I love the fact that Florida has a Department of Environmental Protection. I think that's a fabulous thing. And we've got a handful of counties that are working really hard to engage in environmental protection as well. But here's the thing. I don't think the leadership of the Department of Environmental Protection is allowed to go to the bathroom without permission from the governor's office. They report directly to the governor. And if they are not in lockstep with what the governor's office wants, then they will be replaced and allowed to spend more time with their family and all of that other stuff. So at the end of the day, if, and we are electing people who are more closely aligned with neoliberal thinking, then don't be surprised if our Department of Environmental Protection doesn't do enough protection, sad to say.
In seventh grade, I learned about this thing called checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Palumbo told me that, you have the executive, right, where the agencies lie. But if they're not going to do their job, that the legislature would hold them accountable. And I think in DC, where you often have divided government, one chamber will be in one party, another chamber in the other party, and you'll have the executive being with one of those. You see a lot of these hearings where they'll drag an agency personnel up. I've been doing this for quite a while now, and I've never seen one of these hearings on an environmental issue. We have all kinds of laws that are not implemented. Florida Springs Council has taken DEP to court and whooped them. And I go to the legislators and I say, hey, can we have a hearing where we openly talk about this? And they say, no, we're going to have the agency come up and tell us how Wakulla Springs is doing great. And we'll just pretend like that's representative of everything. I tend to think that the fact that we have, one party control and now supermajorities in both chambers, tends to influence that, so that we don't have the kind of agency oversight that we should, which sends us going to the courts. I mean, do you think that's a fair?
It certainly is. I'll never forget moving out in the late 1990s, in 1997 to Utah, where I taught at Weber State University for a handful of years before moving on. And Utah is a very conservative place, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is a one-party government play, right? The Republicans dominate the entire show there. Democrats are a very small minority. And I remember thinking shortly after moving to Utah and starting to learn about how things worked in Utah, that, wow, this was pretty different than what I was accustomed to in Florida. And not that we haven't had one-party rule in this state before. I think conservative Democrats used to run the state throughout much of the early 20th century as well. But with equally problematic outcomes, because checks and balances only work when government is kind of at war with itself. And if everybody's in lockstep, and that could be one party or the other, then there's not much impetus to get agencies, for example, to do what the law says they're supposed to do. And I think one of the most significant examples of that comes straight from that Springs Protection Law of 2016, where the legislature didn't say pretty please, it said you will produce a definition of harm, not just significant harm. We already have that dealt with by water management districts now, but for outstanding Florida Springs, we need to determine what harm might mean or might look like. And that was passed when? Refresh my memory.
2016.
Yes, 8 years ago that law was passed, and they haven't done anything to deal with that. And the few times they have proposed a definition of harm, it basically has looked very similar to existing definitions of significant harm. No change whatsoever, despite the fact that the legislature demanded that. And I remember at a spring summit, maybe a couple of years ago, was it in Crystal River, where Senator Simmons was very irritated that the DEP was not doing what the legislature instructed them to do. And he says, well, doggone it, what more can we do? We have demanded that they do something. Now, a side of me thinks that, well, maybe some souls on the legislature might call for hearings and haul leadership of the DEP before a public hearing and say, well, the law says you should be doing this, but we see that you really haven't done that. Can you please explain?
Right. And instead, I think it's going to come down to folks taking them to court. And forcing them to do so. All right, my final question for you is, you spent all this research time writing this book. If we made you king of Florida for a day, what would you do? You've got kind of total control. What do we do to protect springs?
I think I might do a handful of things. And I know some of this, it's awful, but I don't think we pay enough for water. I think we probably should charge an additional fee for water consumption. And it doesn't have to be outrageous, but it does have to make the price of water a little bit higher, because we all know, no matter what it is we're consuming, if it costs more, then we find a way to use less so that we can minimize our overall expense. And so if water was made a bit more expensive, then we might use less of it. And that's for everybody, not just some people, not just urban consumers, not just farmers, but all of us should probably pay a bit more for water. We might even pay a bit more for things like fertilizer in case it turns out that excess nitrogen is the problem. Paying more for fertilizer would be a good idea. But I would also do things like raise impact fees on housing, because that's part of how we can raise revenue to wrestle with some of these problems, perhaps to buy critical lands, for example, by local governments. That would go a long way towards protecting springs. Of course, those are very difficult suggestions to make, particularly in this climate, because people are already under pressure and hurting from high prices of lots of things relative to their wages. And so on the one hand, it seems like that's the last thing we should do, but only if you want to do things to help springs. Because we can't put up a drawbridge and at the Florida state line and tell people they can't move here. That's crazy. Nobody wants that. Nobody would support that. And I wouldn't support that either. But we have to find a way to help all of us pay for what it takes to help protect and take better care of springs and to reduce that pressure. Of course, some of it also would call for restrictions on our use of springs. And I know this is a painful thing because many of us have grown accustomed to visiting particular springs, our favorite places and so forth, and splashing in the water and so forth. And then to all of a sudden be told by a government agency, well, you can't use this anymore, or you can only use certain parts of it, whether it's at Ichitucknee or Weeki Wachee or other places. I know they went through that at Crystal Springs Preserve in Pasco County as well. But the bottom line is the results are pretty clear. When we've reduced pressure on the environment, vegetation comes back, the critters come back, and things are a fair bit better for springs.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I really appreciate is that, while we may disagree on some of the causes and uncertainty, when it comes down to the answers, I would have the same answers word for word that you do. And, when it comes to cost, it's really not just about how much it costs, but who pays those costs, right?
Yes.
We pay water bills, but there's no cost to take water out of the aquifer, right?
Right.
Former Nestle, now Blue Triton, right? They paid $115 for their water use permit to pump 1 million gallons a day, and that's it. And when it comes to, impact fees, the roads and schools and everything are still being built. It's a question of, is it going to be built by the people who already live here, or is it going to be built by the people who go into the new homes? And when it comes to water quality, our state spends billions of dollars, maybe not effectively, but of our tax money, right?
Yes.
And that comes from all of us, whether we fertilize or not, as opposed, so it really comes down to those of us that are trying to do well, trying to protect the springs, end up subsidizing the activities that are harming the springs.
Right.
So I don't know how different the actual numbers would be. I think it's a lot more about who's paying the cost than what it is at the end of the day. And I feel like, if people knew that they could benefit financially by protecting the environment, that, that would be a major force to, make development more responsible, use less water, use less pollution, all of those things, instead of it just being wrapped up in the sales tax or your property tax or wherever it is.
Right, right. Pretending that we can offload all of this expense to tourists via sales tax. That's insufficient.
Yes, it's certainly not working. Well, great. We are going to now take some questions from the audience. So, yep, Brenda, Chloe, throw something up, and we'll talk about it. All right, from Catherine Wright. How do we push for more usage of Florida plants and rock gardens instead of the thirsty St. Augustine grass?
Oh boy. I think my wife will cringe when she hears this, but it seems to me that one of these days, maybe it'll be a retirement project when I have a fair bit of time to devote to this, is approach my own homeowner association and say, doggone it, why do we have to have lawns maintained like this? This is a form of collective insanity. And by the way, the natural landscape is pretty good too. It seems to me that we could build sufficient numbers of parks to create open space for kids to play in that aren't very far from home, while allowing our yards to be maybe less playground, but far better at being able to cope with whatever rainfall happens. I mean, the rest of the landscape does it. Why can't our front yard do the same thing like the rest of the Florida landscape?
Right, because there's nitrogen in the air, and it comes down in the rain. I have grass in my front yard because I have to, and I have not watered it except for me standing out there with a hose, which doesn't last long, and I haven't fertilized it in 6 years, and I still have grass. And my neighbors fertilize and water every day, and you can see the difference. But the grass is still green. You're talking about shades of green.
Right.
The greener our grass, the greener our springs.
We're addicted to like the perfect lawn, and breaking that addiction is just going to take more of us. And maybe shame on me for suggesting, I'll keep it as a retirement project. Maybe I should speak up a fair bit sooner and say, I don't think this is a good idea. It's very expensive and it doesn't do our environment any good.
Right. Let's bring up Bob Ulanowicz's question if we can.
Yes.
All right. So, Bob, thanks for being here. Bob wants to know your opinion on tiered water rates predicated on maximal sustainable aquifer yield and universal monitoring, which you kind of touched on, but go ahead and give it a little direct.
Yes. For me, I think the tiered water rates are a good idea. In other words, let's protect those among us who don't have very high income so that you can use X amount of water, whatever that would be, to be able to take care of household use. Maybe not necessarily take care of your lawn, but take care of household use, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing clothes, the bathing, and all of that kind of stuff. But then charge more for additional use. And then above a little bit more, then charge a little bit more, so that people who want to use significant sums of water end up paying a lot more for those additional gallons. We all pay a relatively small amount for what we might need in a household, and then we start paying progressively more. I'm a fan. Count me in. I love the part of it that says predicated upon maximal sustainable aquifer yield. That concept I like that concept, and I'd like to associate myself with that, but I don't know that water managers because we're so addicted to growth, want to talk about, oh, here's the limit to the water we can take out of the ground. I think maybe we ought to talk more about what that limit might be in different parts of different water management districts, because it's probably a good idea. And then the whole issue of universal monitoring, absolutely. Look, we don't have to monitor each individual household. Utilities, for example, we can monitor them because they feed many households. But there are lots of other big users, particularly amongst the agricultural community and industrial communities. We really need to know exactly what they're taking out of the ground. Because if we don't, then we might be barking up the wrong tree in terms of asking one segment of the population to reduce their use when it's really another segment of the population that is using much more water than everybody else.
Right. I mean, you talk about one of my favorite stories from the legislature, which is that same bill, Senate Bill 552, the Florida Springs Council pushed hard and said, look, we have permits. We should probably monitor how much everyone uses, because otherwise it's kind of like having speed limits but no radar guns.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense. And that got amended in that bill to you only have to monitor if you have an 8-inch diameter or higher well, which is capable. A 7-inch well is capable of producing 1 million gallons in absolutely no time, and you can have 6 7-inch wells, and that's fine. And of course, when we begin to look at it, you find out that most people are using wells that have a diameter of less than 8 inches, right? So they wrote the law to intentionally allow most folks, and I would bet that there have not been many 8-inch and greater diameter wells put in since 2016, when you're giving people the blueprint of how not to be monitored.
The market for 7.5-inch diameter wells exploded right after that law passed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Next question. Hannah asks, how can attenuation be better factored into the BMAP plan? So I'll give this one a shot. We've been looking at this a lot. They've got the new BMAPs coming out, but that have allocations for how much each entity has to reduce their pollution by. And where the previous round of BMAPs, those reductions, there were no allocations, but the overall reductions were determined by monitoring at the spring vent. So actually, how much is pollution coming out the spring vent versus the total maximum daily load water quality goal. The reductions are now being estimated by a model that's called the INSILT. And one of the factors that goes into that is attenuation. And, from looking at the numbers that have come out from the department so far, I think their model has some very, very, very significant flaws. We have some spring systems where polluters are being told they have to reduce by 4 times as much pollution as coming out of the spring vent. And we have other basins where we're being told that polluters have to reduce half the amount of pollution coming out of the spring vent. And I think that is some serious problems with the model. And talking to the gentleman who's made the model and talking about attenuation, his response, and I think the problems go well beyond attenuation. I think that we're not properly estimating the amount of loading from an acre of agriculture, from a septic tank, from those things. But he essentially said that attenuation will come out in the wash, because if the attenuation is wrong on the front end, so, if we're getting much less attenuation on the front end, then we'd get a much greater reduction on the back end, right? I'm not going to spend time going into the numbers, but essentially, if your attenuation rate, it's being estimated at 90%, so only 10% of the pollution is going to groundwater, but it's really 50%. When you do the reduction, you'll get a 5 times greater benefit by reducing the same amount. Or vice versa. So that's DEP's current theory, is that they understand that their attenuation rates are probably wrong, but they don't actually think it matters when it comes to their basin management action plans. I don't know whether or not they're right. I certainly do believe that they are significantly underestimating the amount of loading from many agricultural crops. And I think that's why we're seeing that, if you look at Wakaiva, as you talk about water coming out of spring vent isn't the water that came out today, right? Right. It's old. So if you go to an area that's primarily urban and you were to tell me that pollution is much higher today than 20 or 30 years ago when the average age of the water, I can believe that. If you're telling me that pollution in the Santa Fe Basin has reduced by half in the last 20 or 30 years, I have a real problem with that. And that seems to be what we're seeing, is that it tends to be very, very high in the urban spring sheds, the goals, and very, very low in those agricultural spring sheds. And whether that's a bug or a feature, I'm not sure, but it's not right.
In other words, the impact of attenuation is basically being overrun by the amount of loading in the first place.
Absolutely.
And so even if we tinker a little bit and do sufficient science to maybe improve attenuation rates in the model, the big elephant in the room is overall loading.
Right. I think that's true, although it's a little bit, I am very much not a scientist, and I will tell you that it would be a lot better if they got it right. Because I think that, besides the attenuation factor, because I think, besides folks like me who are looking at, how do we achieve these goals for the environment's sake, a lot of local governments now have goals they have to meet. And I think that when you look at, Marion County or the city of Ocala or some of these, relatively rural areas that have enormous allocations now. I mean, just, huge reductions that are going to be really hard to achieve. I think that they're responsible for, and, them and their taxpayers are going to be paying for, they would really like to know that what the right number is, and that they can have confidence in that number as they begin to, tell their constituents, hey, you're all going to have to replace your septic tanks, right? In the Wakaiva Basin, based on the current attenuation rates, we have to get rid of every septic tank and all urban fertilizer in the entire basin. And, that's a daunting task that I don't know how we achieve that. So
daunting
I think
because it's expensive.
Right. I mean, I do think we need a lot more research on attenuation rates. I think that we need a lot more research on the things you were talking about earlier. I think we need water quality monitoring, right? We don't actually know in many cases, all of this is either estimates or it is, lab work, or, they'll go and they'll grow a acre of corn that's being grown by 15 PhD students that are there every day. And then they'll say, this is representative of farming in Florida, when we know that that's absolutely, not the case. We need to be getting those water quality numbers at the farms, not at UF's research plots.
Amen.
All right, next question. All right. Given the lack of helpful data, why isn't there more emphasis placed on arguments in favor of state policies to use the precautionary principle, taking actions that are least likely to cause harm until more data is acquired? Right. Well, I think that's what we've been talking about. I think that's what despite the uncertainty, I think, I won't speak for Chris, but I think that's, when you talk about what he would do to be king or a day, or certainly the policies that FSC advocates for, we may not know exactly what percentage of reduced flow comes from what factor, but we know we can control.
Right.
And, that's a really good place to start.
It is, but it conflicts head on with that notion of freedom that everybody loves. They want to be free to do what they want to do. And if we make decisions based on the precautionary principle, that involves maybe a modest reduction in freedom, which I completely support, because I'd like to see the place left in a better condition than I found it. But it does run into that particular problem. It reduces people's freedom, and people don't want to. I think we need to be better educated to understand that we're never really free to do everything we want, right? We can't possibly drive 70 miles through a school zone. Nobody wants that. That's crazy. We can't build a steel mill on an empty lot that we might own right next to our house. You can't do that either. well, we shouldn't expect to have 100% freedom regarding a range of other activities as well. Not if we want the environment to be halfway cared for. And maybe that's as much as anything else what needs to be spelled out is, okay, if we're going to increase freedom and let people do more, what are the likely consequences of that approach? That needs to be maybe called out better than it is.
And I think we have, different definitions of freedom within our society.
Absolutely.
You could argue, a right to have the freedom to go have green space near your house, and a right to the freedom for clean water and the freedom for clean air, and those things. So it's about what we value.
To be free of poverty, for crying out loud. Absolutely. There's many other freedoms that we should maybe be paying some attention to rather than just raw, I can do whatever I want.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Once again, I highly encourage you, if you enjoyed this, we barely scratched the surface of what's in Chris's book. So definitely pick it up, check it out. I think you'll really enjoy it. If you're not somehow you're not a Florida Springs Council informed member, become a Florida Council informed member. It's totally free. You can, get into our action alerts, find out about these webinars. And if you enjoyed this, please share it. Share this with your social media contacts, your groups, whoever, so people can be part of this conversation. And I think we learned a lot today about the Springs, but also, like Chris says, both the geography, the politics, and the restoration. So thank you very much, Chris. I will see you Monday in St. Pete, and hope you have a great evening.
You do the same. Thanks so much for putting this on, Ryan. This was fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great night. We'll see you again sooner than you think.